We welcome people as you join us today for our everyday ABC conversation on the post-pandemic impact on ministry and stewardship. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two presenters today. The Reverend Dr. Campbell Singleton is senior pastor of Union Baptist Church in Mount Clair, New Jersey, and he has been pastor there for 11 years. He also serves as Associate Executive Minister for the American Baptist Churches of Metro New York. He's responsible for motivating churches both spiritually and financially in their giving to the mission giving program of this region. Campbell has a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Connecticut, an MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry from Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. His D-Min, by the way, focused on respectful dialogue, and this format today fits perfectly with his D-Min emphasis. Dr. Campbell will be presenting second today. Our first presenter is Reverend Stacy Emerson. She is senior pastor of the First Baptist Church of West Hartford, Connecticut. She is our stewardship consultant. She's a part-time staff member with ABC USA. And one of the things that she's done that's so creative is launch the Generosity Project recently. It is about helping congregations deepen their understanding of stewardship as a call to generosity as disciples of Jesus. In this, she continually reframes the stewardship conversation. Stacy has a Bachelor of Science degree from Elizabethtown College in Developmental Psychology and an MDiv from Andover Newton Theological Seminary. One of my first conversations about adaptive change was 15 years ago. It was something brand new on the horizon, and I offered a workshop, and Stacy was in that very first workshop. She has continued to hone those skills, and I think we'll see those skills advanced today. Stacy, we invite you to present at this time.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited to be with all of you. Great for this conversation to happen as we continue to confront all of the challenges post-pandemic. I'm going to share my screen with you and share some slides with you. Here we go. That's just my opening slide. Alan Roxburgh, at the start of the pandemic, wrote this: "Beyond the coronavirus pandemic, the trend of closed, empty churches signifies a far broader shift involving the ending of a form of Christianity that has shaped the West for some time. The Spirit of Christ is calling the church to a remaking. Are we willing to ask what's next from a perspective that may mean the roles for which we trained as clergy will not carry us into this remaking? If this is so, then to discern what's next requires us to recognize we're in a liminal space. We're between a familiar world with its familiar roles and an emerging space we can't see from this point. It means there are no game plans for a new future." And he asked, what kind of posture, therefore, will be needed of us as leaders in this liminal space? We in the church have been living with these changes that the pandemic has wrought for a couple of years now. And so we are still, I feel, in this liminal space that Alan talks about, still overwhelmed, I think, by all that it's requiring of us to change the way in which we do worship, the ways in which we relate as community, and the ways in which we serve our wider neighborhoods and world. And so throughout this time, I believe the church continues to feel that sense of being overwhelmed by all of that, by all of these adaptive changes that we're being asked to make one after another, still unsure whether or not the changes and things we're trying are going to work or mean anything. And add on top of that, what's happening in our country and around the world, and people are just simply overwhelmed. And so this afternoon, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when we get overwhelmed, whether as individuals or as community of faith. I want to start with a story from Frederick Buechner. He was telling the story of a profound encounter that he had on a simple shopping trip. He and his wife were making a quick stop on the way home, And they were in a bit of a rush, so they took the grocery list and tore it in half. And Buechner went to one side of the store and his wife to the other. And as soon as they separated, Buechner remembered something they left off the list. And so he leaned up over the cereal boxes and the cake mixes, and he shouted to his wife on the other side of the store, "Hey, don't forget, we need heavy cream." Well, she got up over the Pampers and the paper towels and she said, "All right, but don't forget you're trying to lose weight." And Buechner said, "Well, hey, you only live once." It was just then, as he said, "You only live once," that something broke through the crust and the deafness. You see, the woman at the cash register who'd been overhearing the exchange, her face flushed and her hair soaked with perspiration that muggy afternoon, when she heard Buechner say, "Well, you only live once," she leaned over the racks of Lifesavers and chewing gum and she said, "Don't you think once is enough?" "It was," said Buechner, "a mild jest, and I laughed a little bit, and my wife laughed a little bit, and the guy stocking the shelves laughed a little bit. But underneath the humor," he says, "I heard a cry. I heard a woman say, 'People come and people go, and I'm tired of them. I'm tired of them, and I'm tired of myself. I'm tired of my life. I'll plug my way all the way to the end, but when the end comes, I won't complain. Once is enough.'" Buechner said, "I'm a minister, and in my soul I heard the joyful voice of Jesus saying, 'I am the resurrection and the life.'" And she rang up the shampoo and said, "Once will be enough. Thank you." I think we resonate with Buechner's story, not only in our friends and neighbors, our colleagues, but even in ourselves and in our churches. And it's a problem when the church feels overwhelmed and turns inward and feels like once is enough. And so what do we do with that feeling post-pandemic, with all the challenges that we're facing? The first is to understand what happens when we are overwhelmed. Sabrina Romanoff says, we have irrational thoughts. We tend to turn inward. We are hyper-focused on things that we can control. We have irrational thoughts like making a problem seem much more bigger than it really is, or people can get paralyzed and freeze and unable to function, even in the most simplest of tasks. We can have disproportionate reactions and overreact to minor stressors, whether that's the loss of keys or in the church, a minor squabble between our friends ends up being something much bigger than it should be. People can tend to withdraw when they are overwhelmed. So we may have been seeing people withdraw from the church because it's all just too much, all of the changes that are happening, all that's being faced in the world. And that can in turn to pessimism, our changes in mood, our cognitive fatigue, the inability to make decisions and solve problems, and certainly physical symptoms we encounter. And so the church, through this time, feeling overwhelmed, has had to deal with all of these quote unquote symptoms in and of ourselves, in our communities and in our congregations, where we tend to focus inward rather than remember the world outside our door. We forget that we are called to share the joy and love of Christ. We instead have turned inward, and our stewardship and generosity have become turned inward as we focus on scarcity instead of relying on God's sufficiency. In the generosity project that Jeff mentioned, we talk about, well, what can we do about that and our understanding of generosity? So my question was, what can we do to lean into God's sufficiency when things feel so scarce and overwhelming? And one of the things that we talk about is, how do you nurture a culture of generosity given all of that overwhelmedness that we are facing? And so I've adapted these words from Barbara Bonner to say, how can we foster openness to new ideas or create a culture of experimentation where it's okay to fail and try again? How can we act with courage, knowing that caution will not move mountains? I think a great part of this healing of our overwhelmedness is to focus on our gratitude. So being grateful and expressing that freely and frequently. A generous culture resists gossip. We celebrate our successes. We foster community and unity. We are generous in our time and attention, even when it seems inconvenient. We listen, we can mentor others. I think one of the great things that we need to do if we're to overcome our sense of being overwhelmed in the church is to abolish a culture of exhaustion. That often needs to start at the top with the pastor who lives an exhausted existence. And how can we in our churches eliminate that to feel the freedom and relief to be able to joyfully continue to serve God in the ways in which we're called. Along those lines, we don't hold grudges, or we practice forgiveness, give the benefit of the doubt to someone who we may have disagreed with, and nurture inspiration. So when we are overwhelmed, there are many things that will help us to renew our spirits. The first is to acknowledge our weariness and our overwhelmedness, to talk about what those symptoms are in our congregations, and to be able to unwrap those and see where they're starting to sprout up and how we can address them within each other. It is critical that we remain in connection with one another and carry each other's joy. I love that phrase, that even when we are weary, we are called to carry each other's joy. Joy lives within a house full of different kinds of emotions. We know this, but it's still one of them. And even when we are weary, the world needs our joy and our hope. Nurturing wonder and awe and gratitude are critical to combating that sense of being overwhelmed and to find our way to resiliency. Sharing stories of hope. We have these wonderful stories and the wonderful story of the good news of Jesus to share with the world. And we can't forget in the church, even when we are weary and overwhelmed, that we have these stories to share. And then to engage in meaningful service with our neighbors and for our neighbors and in the world, realizing that even the most smallest thing can make the biggest difference. We know that it takes just a scrap of light to hold back the darkness, my friends. And so those are some thoughts for me on where we've been post-pandemic and where some of that light and hope is as we continue to move forward and find places of resiliency, even amidst the overwhelmedness. So I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Singleton.
Thank you, Reverend Emerson. Recently, I was in church and I observed a woman who began weeping. And she continued to cry throughout the service. And I reached out to her afterwards to see if she was open to share what was happening with her. And she said that when she came into church and she heard the choir singing and she listened to the prayers, it reminded her of a person who was no longer there and how much that person remembered her, how much that person meant to her. Reverend Emerson has been talking about the overwhelming experiences that some have occurred during the pandemic. And certainly death and grief is a significant part. People died in isolation. Some had no funerals. Some persons' bodies lied for several days and even weeks before the funeral home was able to get there. Others struggled with loneliness. So grief is a part of how persons have come through what they're carrying from the pandemic into our churches. And so how do we express as stewards emotional generosity to care for these folk, to make the church a place where they can come and experience God's healing power? I also noticed that there were persons who would come into church who were using canes and walkers, who were not. And part of the challenge is that as people were, particularly our elders, were in their homes in isolation, they were not exercising as they used to. And so the pandemic helped some of our elders to age. And so one of the things we sought to do was to provide space for our elders to come in fellowship to exercise, which is essential. And we had Christian a person come and provide music for them, and they were able to enjoy that. We also have persons that were overwhelmed with the impact of COVID. They had compromised immune system and they were frightful to come into the church because affecting COVID could be very detrimental to their well-being. And so that's a part of being overwhelmed. And there are other persons who lost jobs or lost income. And one person told me, Pastor, I have to work 7 days a week. I don't want to work this much, but I have to. So there's a level of indebtedness, and people are working out of necessities, even on Sunday. And so the pandemic has created some overwhelming realities for many of our sisters and brothers. And there are some permanent pandemic paradigm shifts. I like alliteration. I'll repeat that again. Permanent pandemic paradigm shifts. So what are some of those as we talk about stewardship of well-being or stewardship of mind, body, and soul? People used to work to live, and now people are living to work. I'll say that again. People used to work to live, and now people are living to work. What do you mean by that? People are no longer working to earn a paycheck and pay bills at the expense of their health and well-being and flexibility to be with their loved ones. Millions use the pandemic to reevaluate their work-life balance and overall health, resulting in a mass exodus from the workforce. The Great Retirement, as it has been deemed by economists, left a massive hole in the workforce, as almost 29 million baby boomers retired in 2020 alone, an increase of more than 3 million from 2019, in order to live out their golden years stress-free and in good health. That is a stewardship issue. And I need to tell you, they haven't changed their minds since. According to Pew Research Center, 75 million baby boomers are predicted to retire by 2030. 75 million baby boomers are predicted to retire by 2030. And I was watching the 60-minute show recently, and they were talking about air traffic controllers and the intensity of their work and the turnover. And many of them are seeking to retire because it's not the way that they want to live with that level of stress. And so we're seeing a shortage of workers in critical areas of our employment sector because people are looking to be better stewards of their bodies, minds, and souls and want a better quality of life. Parents also left the workforce in the middle of the pandemic, and they have not returned. As millions were forced to leave the office and work from home, parents too reevaluated their work-life balance. With children also needing to quarantine at home, many parents were unable to juggle work duties with child-rearing duties, forcing them to make a choice. And they made their choice. Working parents are continuing to exit the workforce, with many turning to gig work, if you will, and have become entrepreneurs, starting their own business, providing for their families without sacrificing flexibility. Well, these permanent pandemic paradigm shifts, I know some of you all like alliteration like I do. These permanent pandemic paradigm shifts in work have been seen in our churches. Many have pulled back from participating in ministry and have not returned. And in the midst of these permanent pandemic paradigm shifts, I have discerned some paradigm callings, some pandemic paradigm callings. God, sisters and brothers, is calling us away from distractions. When the pandemic first occurred, it was an extraordinary time. And I discerned and articulated to those that were in our churches, God is calling us from noise. Everything has been shut down. God wants us to spend more quality time with us. Here in New York City, Broadway lights were dimmed. And for some of you who are sports enthusiasts, there was no National Basketball Association. Wimbledon had been completely canceled for the first time since 1945. Restaurants and clubs and bars and theaters and halls and auditoriums, arenas, stadiums all over the world were shut down. Major League Baseball, the National League, the National Hockey League, Major League Soccer, the Masters, the Boston Marathons, all were postponed and rescheduled. For the first time in 124 years in modern Olympic history, the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo were postponed. We were no longer being entertained. God was and still is calling us away from feeding on these temporary fixes to experience a more fulfilling and satisfactory relationship with God and with one another. The scripture says, Jesus says to us in Matthew 5, verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." Well, during the pandemic, what were we doing? Were we responding in faith to this call to be with God and with one another? Or were we turning to something else as a substitute? Well, the statistics tell us what we were up to. One reality that happened in the pandemic was TV and social media binging. To counter the pain of social isolation and loneliness associated with pandemic, many individuals increased their social media and television consumption to remain engaged. The average child consumed 5 hours of media per day, which was an increase of 7%. I know in my home, my son was using video games to connect with his peers whom he was in isolation with. And so PS4 and other games increased. Alcohol consumption increased as well. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, sales of alcohol increased by 2.9%, the largest annual increase in over 50 years. Families, and you might get a chuckle out of this, were used to coming and going and sheltering in. People were saying, "I see you all the time now." There was a point when I didn't see you enough, but now I'm seeing you too much. And there was a mass exodus from New York City, as well as other urban areas. People were heading for the suburbs. Cramped space contribute to a notable decline in people's relationship with another. According to Bowling Green State University published a study of 714,997 divorces expected to occur nationwide. This is a surprise. In 2020, the actual number of divorces was only 630,505, which was a dramatic 12% less increase. So what happened? There were fewer marriages and likely there were fewer divorces. There was also an increase in internet use and online pornography. Perhaps pornography was a way of people dealing with their loneliness and isolating or even marital conflict. The COVID-19 pandemic led to an increased number of people misusing drugs and dying from drug overdoses. There were more than 99,000 drug overdose deaths in the United States in the first year of the pandemic, an increase of nearly 30% from the year before. And also there became an issue with gambling. We saw that people were beginning to gamble more as a result of being isolated, an increase from 23% to 32%. On average, before COVID-19, 62% of participants gambling was conducted online. During COVID-19, this increased to 78%. And while millions in the United States rushed to purchase guns in the middle of a global pandemic, thinking they were buying safety, research shows gun homicide and suicide increased. Rates of gun assault on children roughly doubled during COVID-19. According to research by the Journal of Medicine. And Black children were at the forefront of these victims. And so we see during the pandemic, people who I believe were called to be closer to God, we're shifting to alcohol, drugs, porn, gambling, social media, TV, guns, and whatever they can do to fill the voids in their life. And I still believe God is calling us away from feeding on these temporary fixes to experience something more fulfilling and satisfactory in our relationships with God. I'm going to leave you with this last one that I find of particular interest in terms of stewardship, which is greenhouse gases. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. The Lord God took the man, woman, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. Those verbs are very important for stewardship, to work it or keep it and to take care of it. Emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases plunged 4.6% in 2020 as lockdowns in the first half of the year restricted global mobility and hampered economic activity. These stringent measures to control the spread of COVID-19 resulted in a significant shutdown of economic activities, which in turn affected the environment by reducing greenhouse gases. COVID-19 pandemic had a considerable impact on global greenhouse gases and perhaps taught us some lessons of what we can do. Now, I want you to hear this. Americans drive trillions of miles every year, helping to make transportation the biggest contributor to United States greenhouse gases. Did you hear what I said? Americans drive trillions of miles every year. It is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases. In 2017, light-duty vehicles in the United States, sorry, I lost my place. 2017, light-duty vehicles in the United States, including cars, SUVs, pickups, and most of the vehicles used for everyday, produce 1,098 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. That's about 1/5 of the country's total emissions footprint. A 10% cut, therefore, would be roughly 110 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, or the same as taking about 28 coal-fired power plants offline for a year. To achieve this, and perhaps this is an area where God is calling, and I'll end with this. Every American driver would reduce their miles per year by $1,350. It would have an immediate impact on our greenhouse gases. And there's more things that we can do. But in the pandemic, we saw what we are able to accomplish. And the global climate impact that we continue to experience can be changed by our stewardship. And so I leave you with these thoughts. I thank you for the opportunity to share and to present in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singleton. Thank you, Reverend Emerson. If you joined us during the presentation, my name's Jeff Woods, and I serve you as General Secretary. You have joined us for one of our everyday ABC conversations. And as we have done with each of these conversations, in a moment, we'll give you an opportunity to respond in a small group format with one another. As KJ is preparing those small groups and putting the questions online for you in the chat, you might want to copy and paste those questions so that you have them in your small groups. But briefly, the questions have to do with continuing to think about these changes that have happened as a result of the pandemic. As Dr. Singleton said, what are the permanent pandemic changes that are happening as a result of the pandemic, these paradigm shifts? And then questions 2 and 3 help us to really move beyond the sense of being overwhelmed, more to a sense of away from scarcity and toward sufficiency, toward abundance and generosity. And then the third one, toward resilience. As American Baptists, we know that we're a people of resilience. What have you been doing after the pandemic to demonstrate that resilience that others might learn from in your small group? as Reverend Emerson was saying, carrying one another's joy. We carry one another's good nature and solutions to some of these issues as well. As one thing is mentioned, we carry that with us and share it with others. Then finally, what is God calling us toward, either as a small group, as individuals, or American Baptists? I remind you of our ABCs for having a respectful dialogue. A is acknowledge differences. Many of you are aware that American Baptist Churches USA are the most ethnically diverse and politically balanced denomination in the U.S. The world needs a denomination like ours, and we need to model respectful dialogue from one another. B stands for be a good listener. Try to spend the majority of your time really listening to one another in these small groups rather than forming what you might say next. And C stands for confidentiality. We encourage you to share the ideas that you hear, but because some of them may be personal, be careful about attributing any of those ideas to a certain person unless you have permission to do so. So again, I encourage you to copy and paste the questions that have been put into the chat. We'll also post those in the small groups. But at this time, then, we encourage you to accept the online invitation that you will see on your screen to join a small group for further dialogue. We will bring you back at the top of the hour simply to say thank you again for joining us and to dismiss us from the conversation. Well, thank you for rejoining us. Thank you for joining us today for this everyday ABC conversation on post-pandemic impact on ministry and stewardship. This is the last everyday ABC conversation that I will be hosting as your General Secretary. If you have not heard, the Reverend Dr. Gina Jacobs Strain will be joining you as General Secretary on February 1st of 2024. We began these conversations as an extension of the respectful dialogue that takes place at our biennial, and we wanted to create more opportunities for people to dialogue around topics that affect us all as Christians, as followers of Jesus. I want to thank again our presenters today, the Reverend Stacy Emerson and the Dr. Campbell Singleton, for their presentation. Again, if you have not joined us before, this is a typical format. We have about 20 minutes or so of some presentation on a particular topic, and then we encourage people to have some small group conversation around this topic. I leave you with one question today, then, for your continued pondering. As we are in the season of Advent, perhaps at no other time of the year, in my mind, is it more clear to us that we serve a God of abundance, that we serve a God of generosity, as we think about our presence with God and celebrating the birth of Christ during this particular month. And so the question is, how does your presence with God and celebrating the birth of Christ help to reframe some of these effects from the pandemic? I'll leave you with that question, and I thank you again for joining us for this everyday ABC conversation. It is at the top of the hour, and we have had 1 hour of conversation as we promised. I'll be on if anyone has a final comment or question, but thank you again for joining us this day.
Thank you.
You see the icon to give to United Mission. If you have not done so, December is a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful month to give a little extra to United Mission that sponsors and makes possible these conversations.